So, for example, we really needed at the time a transportation tax hike. Sound familiar? Still exists today, but all of a sudden, instead of the two sides having shared responsibility for passing a transportation tax hike, the Republicans didn't want to be labeled a tax increaser, and the Democrats wanted to set us up for that. So the ability to do the kind of bipartisan work we had done in the previous 2 years was harder. And the other thing is philosophical differences were emerging in the caucus as we got into, as we had time to think about an agenda beyond the governor's main agenda. So here I was as speaker. One of my main roles, I felt, in the last year was to stop legislation that would have banned affirmative action and to stop concealed carrying of weapons. An element of our caucus really wanted to pass those bills, and I thought it was a mistake for us to do it and ended up blocking them. So it wasn't, honestly, the last 2 years were not as fulfilling for me as shared leadership
as shared
was.
leadership, as shared power.
Yeah.
Well, so 1996 comes, so it was what you just described, plus did you ever have a sickening feeling that maybe you were going to lose the majority and
Sure.
go back in the minority again?
That was a factor for sure.
Yeah.
But there was something else going on. One was personal. Our kids were finally getting ready to enter school. In fact, our daughter was ready to enter kindergarten. And we were basically living in Lansing and living in Holland. And it was getting to be an uncomfortable family situation for our kids, especially. But the other thing was, I really didn't relish whether we kept our majority or lost it. I wasn't relishing the idea of being a lame duck legislator because of term limits.
So term limits was a big factor.
Yeah.
If term limits hadn't happened, you might have hung on maybe one more term anyway and played it by ear.
Maybe. It was really at a stage in our family's life, and it had been a very fulfilling 18 years. I didn't, given where our family was, I really wasn't prepared to think about running statewide for anything, so it was kind of a logical time. But term limits was one of those important factors.
Now, you had picked up a law degree at one point while you were in the House. You went to night school at Cooley
actually,
and stuff.
while I was, I'm trying to think, it was prior to my becoming minority leader, between 83 and 86. I went to Cooley at night over year-round for the 3 years. They had, it's the way John Engler got his law degree.
Right.
And I had postponed my legal education when I went to Washington after undergraduate, and it's something I always wanted to do, never knowing whether I'd ever practice law, but feeling that it would enrich my work as a legislator.
Sure.
So
Help.
yeah.
And did that enter into your thinking in 96 when you decided to retire? Like, not necessarily you wanted to practice law, but that your legal education, in addition to everything you'd done up to that point, might help in what you might want to do going forward?
Yes, I felt that I had another credential that would help in whatever my next job was. I announced in the, as I recall, in the early spring of 96 that I was not intending to run, but I didn't know. I didn't have a clue what I was going to do, and I didn't think it was practicing law. Actually, I thought I would explore maybe helping to set up a public policy institute at Grand Valley, maybe something in higher education. And as I was thinking about that, exploring that, really it was in the fall of that year, along came out of the blue this meeting with the CEO of Comerica at the time, Gene Miller, and Bob Eaton with Chrysler, asking if I would be interested in moving to Detroit to do Detroit Renaissance. And that we really didn't decide, as I recall, until very late in the year, that is the step I would take. We wondered how does this make sense for a Republican from West Michigan to end up in Detroit? But ultimately we decided, we were, as a family, intrigued. Nancy and I were intrigued by the opportunity and decided to do that. And so I think that was announced in December. And if I recall, Christmas Eve, we moved to Detroit.
Wow. and Plymouth actually is where you moved.
Yes.
And you worked in Detroit. How long were you with Detroit Renaissance altogether?
About 7.5 years.
7.5 years,
Yeah.
and then you came to DTE.
DTE, yeah.
Energy. Well, I'm not going to go into it at length,
Yeah.
but having worked in Detroit Renaissance and now in the corporate world, DTE, you've kind of done it all, or most of it anyway, when it comes to government and all facets of public and I mean, how do you look at the challenges that Michigan faces right now, given the experience you've had over the last 35 years?
Well, first of all, when I think about my journey, which I've had no regrets. It has been a fascinating journey, but politically, some would say I've regressed. I started in Washington and ended up at the local community. But in fact, I really do believe that what happens at the regional and local level is the key to Michigan's future. Public policy sets a very important context, for certain. But when I think about the agendas that motivated me to serve in the legislature, issues like cost of doing business, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, tax rates, while they still are important, what is even more important in today's world for the future of Michigan, I believe, is what kind of talent do you attract and keep in the state. I am on the advisory board of a group called Michigan Future, but what really drives that organization is the whole notion that the most successful regions, which really a state is made up of regions. The most successful regions are those that have healthy core cities that are attractive to young professionals who either want to stay or move, that in turn attract entrepreneurial new economy businesses, or keep what's left of auto companies, the research and development parts of our auto industry, in regions like Southeast Michigan or West Michigan. That's a different policy agenda. It really is, I think, about investing in higher education, having a strong transportation, information technology infrastructure. It's a different role for government than I visualized as a young legislator, who is mainly just thinking about competitive business costs and tax rates. And so I think we need to be careful as a state at a time when government doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. We have to be careful not to dismantle government to the point where we can't make necessary public investments that really do contribute to healthy communities and the attraction of talent.
Do you think the shift in your thinking is mainly due to the fact that you're no longer in the legislature, you're no longer in elective office, you were with Detroit Renaissance, you're with DTE Energy now, or do you think you might have arrived at your point of view anyway, if you were still in the legislature? And what does that say about legislators now?
Yeah.
Are they trapped in the same mentality maybe you had when you were in the legislature yourself?
Well, we all need to represent our constituencies, and I represented a more conservative constituency, probably as a more moderate Republican. One of the beauties of pre-term limited legislatures is that you could serve long enough that your constituency maybe didn't always agree with you, but came to trust how you made decisions. Mm-hmm. So you could maybe stretch beyond just the public opinion in your own district. But to your question, I think if I had stayed in the legislature, I probably would have had a harder time understanding and supporting the kinds of public investments I think from the outside now I see as necessary for communities.
Well, as you say, a lot of this is due to term limits. I mean, they're not there long enough to really begin to understand and appreciate some of the stuff that you've been able to understand and appreciate.
Yeah. One of the curiosities, honestly, Bill, is that I predicted I was opposed to term limits, but one thing I thought would occur is that you would see more leadership at the state level emerging from local offices and bring more of a community building perspective. What are those things that are important to communities? I'm not sure that has happened. In fact, there seems to be more tension between local municipalities and state government now than there was then.
How do you feel about Detroit as a city? You were the head of Detroit Renaissance. You just said a few minutes ago, a healthy core city in a region is really kind of the anchor for economic development and a healthy economy and everything else. How do you think things are going?
It's become an overused term, I guess, but Detroit really is truly a tale of two cities. What's happening in the Midtown area where you've got Wayne State University and the cultural institutions, and in the downtown with now Quicken Loans, Dan Gilbert, purchasing buildings and beginning to invest, you have a very bright future. In fact, young people are moving to the downtown. In fact, it's hard now to find an apartment in Midtown and downtown. We have to start building new housing or converting older buildings. But you get beyond the central city, that Woodward corridor, and of course neighborhoods have been declining.
The neighborhoods.
When I moved to Detroit in '96, there were 180,000 students in the Detroit public school system, and about 1.1 million residents in the city. Today there are about 48,000 students in the school system and probably a little more than 700,000 residents. And that's all about middle income families, largely African American families, moving out of the city into the suburbs, pursuing better school systems and safer neighborhoods. And so that's the other city in Detroit, which is going in the wrong direction. The mayor, current mayor, Mayor Bing, I think has rightly started talking and studying the idea of redensifying neighborhoods. We can't, city services in Detroit no longer can sustain people scattered over this broad territory.
Right. Well, okay, let me just ask you one last question. Governors you have known. When you were first elected, Bill Milliken was governor. Then you had Jim Blanchard.
Yeah.
Then you had John Engler. And now you have not only Jennifer Granholm after you left office, but now Rick Snyder, who you've come to know in your post-government jobs. Yeah. What's your opinion of those five people?
Well, that's a short answer. I stay in touch with Bill Milliken still today, and just so deeply admire him. One of the early problems I probably had in my own district was that he was not very popular. He was far more moderate and friendly to Detroit than West Michigan wanted him to be.
Right.
And I had to represent my constituency. I couldn't support him on some big votes that he needed, but I admired the way he problem solved. He worked across the aisle. He was tougher than his public persona.
Yeah, sure he was. Absolutely.
And he did a good job of really exercising or imposing some discipline on the Republican minorities in the House and Senate.
Remember the last 8 years he was in office, he had Democratic majorities in both the House and Senate. He never had what Rick Snyder and John Engler had.
Exactly.
And a lot of people forget that.
And he accomplished so much under those circumstances.
Exactly.
Jim Blanchard what I admire about Jim Blanchard is the team he put together. When you think of the Rick Coles and the Bob Bowmans and the Pat Babcocks and then Sister Agnes, you know, across the board, Doug Ross, he had some really strong cabinet members